As Trump sends more signals he's losing patience with Ukraine and President Zelensky, his administration, in a proposed UN resolution, is refraining from condemning or even acknowledging Russia as the aggressor in this conflict or expressing belief in Ukraine's territorial integrity. President Trump has elevated his longtime close personal friend Steve Witkoff to the center of some of his biggest global challenges. Witkoff has been a central negotiator with Russia. He met directly with Vladimir Putin. And just before Trump took office, Witkoff negotiated the Israel-Hamas ceasefire and is currently working on phase 2. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff joins us now. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters yesterday that President Trump feels, quote, very strongly that Russia is willing to make a deal, unquote, and that he's, quote, very confident we can get it done this week, unquote. Is that true? Are you that close to a deal with Russia and Ukraine to end the war completely?
Well, I would say, Jake, just first generally that you're seeing a lot of movement in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and I think it's in large part because people are responsive to President Trump. So, and that's fundamental. I think it's guiding almost all negotiations out there in these sectors. So it's a big data point. Second data point is the way Mark Fogel came out. President Putin, and I commend him for it, it was a little bit squirrely, you know, on that day that Mark came out. Certain things needed to be done, and President Putin was very, very flexible in his thinking, released him, and I think it was a huge signal to President Trump that he wants to get a deal done. Our conversations in Saudi Arabia with the Secretary of State and with the National Security Advisor were, in my view, positive, constructive, and clearly momentum building. So I would say that I'm optimistic and positive, just as the president is, that we can get something done rather quickly.
I think everybody watching can understand the need for diplomacy, and especially President Trump wanting to reset the relationship with Russia. But what do you say to the millions of Americans and people around the world who are concerned that the United States right now doesn't seem to understand who actually launched this war against Ukraine and is actually trying to sidle up to the bad guys, Putin and the Russians, while screwing over the good guys, Zelensky and Ukraine? I think that is a fear that a lot of Americans have.
Well, look, I've heard that kind of talk. I don't necessarily agree with it. But let me say this. I'll make a few comments. The first is that the war, irrespective of who started it, needs to end. Too many people's lives have been expunged as a result of it, and it just doesn't make sense to the president. He wants to be the peacemaking president, peace through strength, and I don't blame him. I actually concur right down the line with his thought process around this. That's one. Two, that the war didn't need to happen. It was provoked. It doesn't necessarily mean it was provoked by the Russians. There were all kinds of conversations back then about Ukraine joining NATO. The president has spoken about this. That didn't need to happen. It basically became a threat to the Russians. And so we have to deal with that fact. And those are real facts on the ground here. But be that as it may, the Russians have indicated that they are responsive to an end to this. There were very, very what I'll call cogent and substantive negotiations framed in something that's called the Istanbul Protocol Agreement. We came very, very close to signing something, and I think we'll be using that framework as a guidepost to get a peace deal done between Ukraine and Russia, and I think that will be an amazing day. And the fact is, the president understands how to get deals done. Deals only work, Jake, when they're good for all the parties, and that's the pathway that we're on here.
Of course, just a reminder of viewers, Russia seized Ukrainian territory in 2014 with Crimea. They've been going into the Donbass region and seizing land in eastern Ukraine long before they attacked 3 years ago when they did the full frontal assault. You just suggested Russia was provoked. Trump is publicly attacking Zelensky as a dictator. He blamed him for starting the war in the first place, called for new elections in Ukraine, took NATO membership for Ukraine off the table. He said it's unlikely Ukraine will be able to get back its territory seized by Russia. Russian state TV suggests that President Trump is getting all of this straight from his conversations with President Putin. Take a listen.
Трамп отвечает на вопросы по поводу пресс-конференции.
When Trump is answering questions about the press conference, I think it is not a coincidence that many of the narratives that are being voiced largely materialized after their conversation.
Но фразы, которые он дает,
The phrases he is saying are so deep and so correct. They are in total alignment with the way we see things.
Do you think it's good that the Russians think that the Trump administration is in total alignment with the way that Putin sees things?
I think we've had, Jake, by my estimation, almost 1.5 million deaths here. And finally, we have a leader, that is President Trump, who is determined to end the carnage. And so the only way you're going to end the carnage is if you have a relationship with the leaders of both countries that are involved. I went over to Russia. I had a meeting with President Putin. It was a long meeting, positive, constructive. Lots of good things got discussed, in large part because the president enjoyed a positive relationship with President Putin from his first term in office. And that then evolved into a positive conversation with the president on a telephone call from the White House. And then there was a positive conversation with President Zelensky. So I think you've got to have these relationships. You've got to have communication. That's the only way you get deals done.
So President Trump wants President Zelensky to give the United States sweeping access to Ukraine's rare earth mineral deposits as repayment for all the aid the U.S. has given Ukraine. Zelensky rejected the original proposal. He suggests that Ukraine needs to get more assurances from the United States of future support and security guarantees. Where do these negotiations stand?
Well, Jake, let me say this with regard to the mineral rights agreement. The president came into office, and lo and behold, what did he find out? That we are the majority share of the aid to Ukraine, so we're funding it, and we were funding it with no arrangement to pay it back. Alternatively, the Europeans, who were most affected by this war, were funding the minority share, and they had agreements to pay it back. So, as is typical of the president, he's very, very sensible. He said to himself, that makes no sense to me. Why would the American public, taxpayers here, be funding the majority share, not get anything back? The Europeans funding the minority share, they get everything back. So this agreement is much about repayment for all that we have done on behalf of the Ukrainian people. And that's the way the president sees it. I expect to see a deal signed this week. You saw President Zelensky waver in his commitment towards that a week ago. The president sent a message to him. He's not wavering anymore. I think there's a reason he's not wavering. It's because he realizes that we have done so much and that agreement belongs being signed. And I think you'll see it signed this week.
President Trump has been putting a lot of pressure on Ukrainian President Zelensky, as you just noted, and laying out the concessions Ukraine will have to make to end the war. What concessions will Russia have to make?
Well, I think in any peace deal, each side is going to make concessions, whether it's territorial concessions, whether it's economic concessions. I think there's a whole array of things that happen in a deal, and you'll see concessions from both sides. And that's the president's, that's what he does best. He brings people together. He gets them to understand that the pathway to peace is concessions and consensus building. And I think you're going to see a very successful result here. We've been struggling with this conflict for 3.5 years. No different than Gaza. The president has basically said to himself, we need something more purposeful. What we've been doing in the past has not worked. Now it's time to get something to work. And if we get something to work, then we're going to have a lot less we're going to have lives saved, and both peoples in both countries are going to live in a better way.
The biggest difference, as I see it, between the two conflicts are that there's also this question of the European alliance when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. The front runner to be the next chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, warned European leaders that they must, quote, prepare for the possibility that Donald Trump will no longer uphold NATO's mutual defense commitment unconditionally. That's part of the NATO pact. An attack on one is an attack on all. You're a close advisor to President Trump, a close friend of his. If Russia attacked a NATO ally, would President Trump honor the United States' commitment under Article 5 to defend allies in NATO?
I think the president has never said anything of the sort. I think what he said is that NATO exists, that the U.S. has always supported NATO, that we've supported it by funding more money than the European countries have in the past, and yet he continues, or Americans continue to be criticized for not standing up. I just don't understand the rationale behind that.
So Friedrich
We've
Merz is
done
just
more
wrong,
than
you think?
most. Yeah, I just think it's unfair, actually.